On this show, you hear very few predictions. It's about fact-checking the news, and I can't fact-check a prediction. But everything I've seen across all my years in mainstream news and everything I'm seeing now makes me confident that we are about to face something, an unprecedented weaponization of polling. In the coming weeks and months, you will be subjected to a daily onslaught of claims about polls, particularly polls in the presidential race. And so many of those claims will be about manipulating you, trying to stoke all the negative emotions, fear, dread, hopelessness, anger, bitterness, frustration. Some of this happens in every election, but now we are in uncharted terrain. Americans and really humanity in general are so not ready for this. I want to steel you against it so that these bad actors cannot do this to you. And the media definitely won't help because they benefit from this problem big time, as I'll explain ahead. The polls won't just be used to divide America even further into two groups. They will be used to try to divide Democrats over and over into multiple fighting factions. It's time for a whole new understanding of polls, why it did make sense for President Biden to drop out of the race, but why it does not make sense to use polls to try to determine who's going to win in November. You might be thinking, wait, how can those two things coexist? I'll explain. Looking at polls and what they mean also requires looking beyond politics. And when I invited listeners to send in questions about polls, I got lots of questions like this.
I saw a poll that claimed only 8% of Palestinians believe what Hamas did on October 7th was wrong. How do we know if this poll and its numbers are legitimate?
Also today, when people's opinions are based on lies that are being propagated by news agencies, how can someone then try to use interviews in those same news agencies to get the truth out? Today, I interview someone who deals with that exact challenge all the time. Polls, lies, and this sound effect that's titled fear. I'll explain all that today on They Stand Corrected. Hi, welcome. I'm Josh Lebs. This is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which is all about fact-checking the news. With every episode, I send out a newsletter that's packed with links and images and all sorts of good stuff. You can sign up for that for free. All of it's available through the show notes and at my website, joshlebs.com, JOSHLEBS.com. This show exists with your support, and I'm so appreciative to everybody who is supporting this show. One of the best ways to support it is to go to the free newsletter and choose to become a paid subscriber. Anyone who is a paid subscriber to this show can join in on the comments in the newsletter. And that way you don't have to worry about haters and spammers weighing in on what you have to say. It's direct access to me. Anyway, let's dig into this topic. As soon as President Biden dropped out of the race, a lot of the news coverage immediately went, of course, to polls and what they say about Vice President Kamala Harris versus Trump. Here is what you would expect from Fox.
Speaking of where the race is right now, take a look at this new Quinnipiac poll. Donald Trump continues to lead in this race, 49-47 over Harris.
CNN looked at polls too and then mentioned this afterward.
We have to be clear. There hasn't been time for a poll since Kamala Harris announced. It just happened.
Yes. So all this polling was taken before Kamala Harris actually became the likely and now presumptive Democratic nominee.
So many voters in America don't follow the race this closely early on. To them, anything before September is early. And as of those polls, they didn't know much about Kamala Harris yet. So what those polls were showing at that point was not indicative of much. But then you might wonder, if the polls don't tell you much this early on, why did Biden drop out? Well, here is former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill, a Democrat, discussing Biden's decision. This was on MSNBC.
I think his staff brought him numbers from the swing states that showed that not only was he running 10 to 15 points behind the Democratic senators in the same states and clearly underwater in those swing states, but that also he was losing ground in other states that they had thought were safe, quote unquote.
Biden's decision did make sense. those figures were not tight enough to overcome in the short time frame between now and when people start voting early. Politico reported that top Biden advisors sat down with him and showed how his fundraising had slowed considerably as well. And they showed him that his own campaign's polls showed that, quote, his path to victory in November was gone. I know people who feel that even these polls should not be seen as meaningful and that Biden should have stayed in the race. But Biden and his team knew what they were doing. And the massive historic fundraising haul for Kamala Harris within hours of Biden's announcement proved that there is a new infusion of hope and energy for a Democratic victory in November. Anyway, at this point, the decision is made. We know who the candidates will be. Now, polls are really only relevant to people in the campaigns in making decisions, like where to expand their ground operations, where to invest more in advertising. Maybe if you're looking to volunteer, then the polls could be relevant to you, showing where you could best put in your efforts. But outside of that, they're not going to have much value to you in general. The political reality is something that CBS pointed out. They started with a very obvious statement. You'll hear it and be like, yeah, we knew that. Then they played someone explaining how this will ultimately be decided.
We spoke to political and communications consultant Alex Clemens, who says Harris absolutely improves Democrats' chances in November. But there's a big if she reaches the right voters in the right places. Listen.
This has been the holy grail of political statisticians since time immemorial. A few 100,000 voters in 3 or 4 or 5 states are going to decide this election. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin. If Kamala Harris picks up these 3 states and nothing out of the question happens, she'll win.
What that consultant said is surely true based on what keeps happening in every election. Turnout for each side and a handful of states will determine the result. So why would you possibly need to know every day what the polls look like? You don't. But they do have a big emotional effect. And some political operatives want to manipulate your emotions. So they're surely going to push arguments about polls. And here's something important to understand. A big goal will be to get you to not vote at all. See, here's something we know. Trump won the Electoral College in 2016, not only because of who voted for him in certain states, but also because of who did not show up to vote at all, or who voted for a third-party candidate, just not voting for Clinton. Here's a quote from Trump that got a lot of news coverage. This is a clip of it being read on MSNBC.
Many blacks didn't go out to vote for Hillary because they liked me. That was almost as good as getting the vote, and it was great, the president-elect said.
And just FYI, when that quote was reported, Trump's own team did not dispute it. So how does that play into polls and the current reality? The Trump team knows that if it can get people who usually vote Democratic to get angry at the party or angry at the new candidate, then maybe they won't show up to vote or just won't vote for Harris. And because of Biden's decision, the Trump team has easy fodder to get Democrats angry. Every time there's any kind of dip for Kamala Harris in any poll, the Trump team will see that as a chance to win over people who supported Biden and wanted him to stay in the race. You can expect right-wing media to have headlines like this. Panicking Dems say, "What have we done? Bring back Joe." Probably with an exclamation point in the headline. Or, Kamala tanks in latest polls. And then they'll have a quote from someone saying, "We should have stuck with Joe," insider says. Or something like, "Fury, anger, betrayal, and infighting overtake Harris campaign." All of that will be designed to push divisions inside the Democratic Party. And the Trump team will try to get disaffected Biden supporters to vote for Trump. He did that with disaffected Bernie Sanders voters in 2016.
All of those Bernie Sanders voters who have been left out in the cold by a rigged system of superdelegates, we welcome you with open arms.
It's also likely that the Harris campaign will push all the most positive polling results they can for her. But the fact is, when polls are pretty close, they do not tell you the result. You've probably heard this in the news, but in 2016, looking at polls, the widespread conventional wisdom was that Hillary Clinton would win. And while she did win the popular vote by a lot, it did not get her the Electoral College. The race is close. Anything can happen. And there's just too much polling going on. I saw this one line at The Hill. I'll include a link to it in the newsletter. It was a chart showing polling averages in the race. And they had this line. It said their chart was based on an average of 73 polls. 73 freaking polls? Why do we have so many? Actually, I'll tell you why. Money. The polling and media industries are working together in this cyclical system to enrich each other. News agencies themselves partner with polling agencies, often to conduct these polls. That's why you hear the name of a news agency often as part of the name of the poll. And why? Because it gets you to click. Your emotions, your needs, your hopes, your fears, all of those things drive traffic to these news sites. They will keep overwhelming all of us with an insane onslaught of polls every day from now until the election. I don't do a lot with sound effects on this show. They don't often apply in fact-checking, but there's a strategic reason that I shared one with you at the top. This sound effect, it's called Fear 5, and it's kind of unintentionally funny. Here it is again. When you find yourself getting afraid because of the latest polls, remind yourself of that ridiculous sound. Remind yourself that news agencies are trying to make you freak out about polls every day, because then you'll click. Unless that sound effect comes across differently to you. I hope it doesn't come across like Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally. In that case, forget that I ever played it for you. Either way, at this point, worrying about daily ups and downs in these averages is useless. All right. When I invited you all to send in your questions about polls, I got some really interesting responses, including something that some people on the far left just really don't want to hear. That is after this. I am so grateful to the sponsors coming along to make this show possible, including MIT45. The company is on a mission to bring peace, vitality, and relief to the world by empowering individuals to be more of their unique, incredible selves. They do this by creating innovative, exceptional products, sourcing high-quality materials, and keeping standards high, including for safety. Their products include Kratom, and the folks at MIT45 want you to learn all about it and make informed decisions. When I invited your questions about polls, I got a bunch like this.
Hi, Josh. This is Ailey from Sammamish, Washington. Thank you for providing the truth during a time when almost all journalism has become biased and fueled by political agendas. I saw a poll that claimed only 8% of Palestinians believe what Hamas did on October 7th was wrong. As a longtime advocate for peace and a two-state solution, this number was a gut punch. How can peace be possible when only 8% of the population considers the humanity of the other side? How do we know if this poll and its numbers are legitimate?
Thanks much, Ailey, and to all of you who are sending in questions. In general, tons of things that are referred to as surveys and polls make it into the news but are not legitimate. Sometimes they have tiny sample sizes, or they didn't follow certain basics aimed at getting a representative selection of people. In this case, there's polling from a group based in the West Bank. It does seem to be a legitimate statistical effort. It's from the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. I've looked at some of their stuff in the past, and I'll include a link to that in the newsletter. What they write about in terms of their methodologies suggests that there is an attempt to get a representative sample. Now, that said, in both the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians do not operate with democracy. There are limits on how much we can know and trust about what any agency puts out. Still, these figures are in keeping with other survey figures that I've seen. We do have a reason to believe that these awful findings are indeed representative. Their survey from June shows that the majority of Palestinians support the October 7th attacks and support Hamas. This is so important to understand because the image that a lot of people like to provide is a fake one. They like to pretend that Hamas somehow has nothing to do with Palestinians and what they want. But cultures exist. Kids are taught lessons in schools, and I've discussed this in previous episodes. These horrific lies about the rest of the world, lies about Jewish people, and they are taught support for terrorism. They hold celebrations when people are killed in terrorist attacks. They hand out candy and have fireworks. Interestingly, in the latest survey, there's more support for the October 7th massacres among Palestinians in the West Bank than among Palestinians in Gaza. You might think, well, that's because of what people in Gaza have been going through since the war. But even in Gaza, a majority still support. Haley, in that question, asked specifically about what percentage believe the attacks were wrong. Here's where things get tricky. Palestinians were asked in the survey whether it was the correct decision. In the latest figures, 17% said it was an incorrect decision. But that does not mean morally wrong. Some people think it was incorrect for pragmatic reasons, or should have been done differently, or it could be anything. A better ethical gauge is on the question of war crimes. Here's what the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies points out about this poll.
Only 9% of Palestinians think that Hamas has committed war crimes since October 7th.
Only 9%. It's also unclear what they would even consider to be a war crime, given the kinds of things that they support. And there's another crucial figure that the Foundation points out.
90% of Palestinians have not seen videos showing Hamas's treatment of Israeli civilians.
90% have not seen what Hamas did to civilians and is doing to civilians. If you've been listening to this show, then you've heard me talk about how certain news figures have been complaining, insisting that Israelis are the ones not seeing what's happening to Palestinians. I'm keeping an eye out for whether anyone bothers to point out what this poll has found, that Palestinians are not getting the truth in their media. You can help demand that our news organizations start reporting that stuff. I'll explain how in a bit. Coming up, an interview with someone who tries to get out the truth in media that themselves push lies. Right after this. Thank you, Nextiva, the platform powering more than 100,000 businesses and billions of conversations every year. Nextiva integrates all conversation channels and powers personalized experiences at scale throughout the entire customer journey. Say goodbye to siloed apps and say hello to the unified customer conversation solution. Learn more at nextiva.com. We're back. This is They Stand Corrected. I'm Josh Lebs. In general, polls should explore not just what people think, but also what they know. Every poll looking at the presidential race should also ask basic knowledge questions, like about whether the 2020 election was stolen. It wasn't. Or about whether Trump has been convicted of felonies. He has. Take a look at how voters across the political divide stack up on knowledge. Lies fuel opinions, and the media should be exposing the extent to which opinions are fueled by lies. But, as you know if you've been listening to this show, sometimes the media is the problem, pushing the lies in the first place. Imagine Kamala Harris going in for an interview on a staunchly conservative TV network that has pushed lies and conspiracy theories. What would she do in a few minutes in an interview there? What would you do if people believed lies about you or an entity you represent, and then you were there to be interviewed? What would you do in just those few minutes? I spoke with someone who faces that situation frequently. Anat Sultan Dadon. She's the Israeli consul general to the southeastern United States. As we head into this interview, here's what you should know. On this show, I have pointed out how news organizations have rules requiring anti-Israel bias. I know that because I worked inside mainstream news for 20 years. I know that what I'm saying can be hard to believe, which is why it's important to listen to the earlier episodes in which I talk you through those rules, those standards and practices that require anti-Israel bias. I also wrote a piece about it in Newsweek, and you can see that in my newsletter. I pointed out things like the language that is used just for Israel, like the inaccurate use of the terms occupation and international law. I talk about the misrepresentations of history, the refusal to call attacks terrorism only when Israel is attacked, even if it's the exact same kind of attack that is called terrorism elsewhere. all of that stuff is enshrined inside many news agencies. Anat Sultan-Dadon does a lot of interviews with news organizations that have those rules. I spoke with her about what that's like.
I think, unfortunately, this is not true for all media, but it is true for many media, not just here in the United States. I've been with the Israeli Foreign Service for about 20 years now, and this is something that we see in many places where Israel is treated differently. And anything to do with Israel, not just this current war that we are in, but anything to do with Israel is often treated differently than any other country is treated by the media.
Yeah. And if you're brought in for an interview, it's only supposed to last 3 or 5 minutes. Let's say it's a live interview on radio or TV or whatever. There isn't time or opportunity for you to say, can we just start from the beginning and make clear what actually happened in 1948, or where every country in the entire world came from, or the fact that the Arab world was built through occupation and enslavement and slaughter and all these other things, or the fact that there are all these occupied territories around the world. You can't even get to those basics. So when you are dealing with the media, what goals do you have? What do you try to get done in those little blocks of time?
It's always about trying to get as much of the accurate messaging as possible through to the viewers. And you're right, everything has become much more superficial. And so the viewers often do not have that in-depth historic knowledge or acquaintance as possible. It's a challenge for anyone advocating for Israel to try and get not only the messaging across about what is currently happening, but a little bit of the context, because yes, often even the premise of the questions assume facts that are actually not true.
If you say something's not true, then they might say to you, well, we're the reporters. We get to say what's true or false, right? It just seems like a no-win proposition. Like, I've been talking a lot about the death tolls and how all these media have been saying the vast majority are women and children. And now even Hamas isn't saying that in their latest numbers. But you can't then come along and say that's not true, right? Or you can try, but if you do, then they'll say, well, who are you to tell me? Why should I trust you?
But I can ask, where else in history has the media chosen to take a terror organization at its word? Because any data referencing casualties in Gaza is coming from a terror organization. If it's the Gaza Health Ministry, that is run by Hamas. Anyone who is quoting UN figures, the UN is taking their figures and their data from Hamas. I'm not familiar with the media taking at face value a terror organization's word in any other case.
You must, in your position, sometimes have meetings with members of the media. Are they willing to listen to you then, or do you still feel that there's just so much that they believe that's false that it's hard to reach most of them?
I think that there is often a curiosity. I think this is part of what journalism is about, right? People arrived in this profession because they are curious and want to learn about the world. But yes, often they are learning through a lens. Since October 7th, all of these demonstrations, for example, that we're seeing all around the world, including here in the United States, they are constantly being referenced as pro-Palestinian. That premise is factually incorrect, because there is nothing about these demonstrations or these demonstrators that is truly about caring for the Palestinians or getting them any closer to a better future for them. Because if one is pro-Palestinian, then one would think, okay, I want to see a better future for the Palestinians, right? But there will not be a better future for the Palestinians with them remaining under the oppression of a Hamas organization that is oppressing its own people, sacrificing its own people, and investing in the destruction of their neighbors rather than in building a future for their people. And I think that the media has an important role to play here, which it is so far largely not playing, in asking those questions, and asking the demonstrators, and asking Palestinian leadership. Because someone needs to tell the Palestinians the truth, and all of these demonstrators the truth. There will not be self-determination for the Palestinian people at the cost of the existence of the state of Israel. And that is a truth that is not being said. Instead of that, the media is providing support for this delusion that there will be a free Palestine at the cost of the existence of the state of Israel.
It's also just such an obvious obsession because there are people struggling all over the world. And the idea that the media care oh so very much about the people of Gaza, as though that has nothing to do with a global effort to get people to hate Jews. That concept is ridiculous. Part of what I've talked about on the show, an estimated minimum 600,000 civilians died in 2 years in Ethiopia this decade. Each year, the number of people dying in Syria is hard to calculate, but in 1 year alone, 110,000. Huge numbers of them children. And having been in the media, I have seen those stories don't get, a fraction of the attention. Jordan gets money and military support from the United States, and no one is saying, quick, let's explore whether or not they should get that. Same with Ethiopia. When you look at so many mainstream American news organizations keep fixating on Israel and this one conflict, how do you view it as an Israeli and as a representative?
For years, we have been overrepresented and overcovered in the media. I distinctly remember one conversation that I had with a journalist in Europe. I spent years also on postings in Europe. I called this journalist up about a very biased reporting, and the journalist told me, Anat, I'm sorry, I can't keep dealing with Israel all the time. And I said, by all means, I agree with you. The obsession to deal with Israel, it is part of the bias, and it does a disservice to the real issues that should be receiving attention. And I'm not saying that this war currently that Israel is fighting against the terror organization should not be covered. It should be covered because this is not just about Israel. This is not just Israel's fight. Israel is on the front line of fighting a radical Islamist ideology that is a threat to the entire free world. It should be covered. But are other issues around the world not worthy of attention, not worthy of discussion? Is the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, in Africa, in so many places around the world, is that not worthy of being covered, of receiving attention? I think that there needs to be some sort of balance, because the public deserves better. We all deserve better because to a large extent, the media has a role in shaping public discourse, in shaping policy, in shaping what decision makers deal with.
She also said something really interesting about the big picture, that and how you can set the media straight on political polls too after this. This is your musical backdrop for a moment of digital action. Rate or review this show, share it, post it on social media, subscribe to the show or to the newsletter if you haven't yet, or just tell everyone in your entire hemisphere that they should tune in. Now's the time. Lies in the media have a profound effect on what people's opinions are. Those opinions then show up in polls. I mentioned that Anat Sultan-Dadon, the Israeli consul general to the southeastern United States, said something really interesting about the big picture.
The advantage that we do have going for us is that we have truth on our side. I really do think that that is our greatest advantage. We know our history. We know who we are. We know what we are about. And that makes, I think, for the best unwavering stand in the face of those who change narratives and change realities according to the moment and what will serve their agenda.
What she said here was about Israel, but the same idea can apply to anyone who wants to pierce through lies with the truth. People make choices about what to stand for: truth or lies, conspiracy theories or reality, hate and division or hope and unity, democracy or fascism. It's easy for the media to point to polls and say, here's how people are feeling, whether it's about presidential politics or Israel or anything else. What we need is for the media to get rid of the vast majority of that noise and instead focus on facts. That means weeding out bigotry and false assumptions. It means doing the job of journalism, what I talk about on this show, putting truth first. That requires two things: facts plus context. We need the media right now to stop the daily efforts to get people angry and scared and hopeless so that they'll click and share and doomscroll. How can we get them to do that? Here's how. In my newsletter, I have sample text that you can send to news agencies anytime you see them doing, well, pretty much anything wrong, but especially the specific things I talk about on this show. So you will find in my newsletter text on what to send to a news agency if you see them inundate you with scare tactic headlines about polls designed to make you despair. And if they share polls with you about how Americans are feeling about Israel, you can point out that they should be looking at what people know and don't know. Here's a faster thing you could do. Send me links. If you choose to be a paid subscriber at the newsletter, then you have access to the comment section and you can post links right there, which I might fact check. You can also send in questions, just like you heard in this episode, and I might answer it right here on the show. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week.